Good morning, everyone. We were just waiting for the streaming of the event to start. Thank you for being with us today on an early Friday morning, cold Friday morning, one of the first of the Washington winter. My name is Denise Yanovich, and I'm the Managing Director of the Georgetown Americas Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here to an incredible panel to talk about Chile after 50 years. Guillermo, who has joined us directly from Chile, has told us that that's everything that everyone's talking about in Chile. So we're glad to be talking about it at Georgetown today. Briefly, many of you might not know what the Georgetown Americas Institute is. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to self-promote the Institute. It was established in 2020, and it's a platform for dialogue, research, and impact around the key challenges facing Latin America and the hemisphere. It comes at a moment where our hemisphere is at a crossroads. The region has made great strides since the years of the unrest of the 1980s. Notable economic and social progress has been achieved through a commitment to integration and democracy. The region remains the most democratic in the developing world, and its democracies have shown resilience and vitality despite challenging circumstances. Elections keep happening. I'm from Colombia. On Sunday, Colombia showed its voice. The Colombians showed their voice through the elections, and this, we can see it all around the region. However, there is growing evidence of democratic backsliding and economic instability and inequality in the Americas. This will require greater engagement from interested parties to positively impact and devise solutions to the most pressing issues. As the Georgetown Americas Institute, we hope to bring issues from the region to the forefront of the conversation, both at Georgetown and Washington, D.C. As part of our work in 2022, we launched a series of events called Spotlight on the Americas, and today's event, in collaboration with CLAS, the Center for Latin American Studies, is part of that series. We are incredibly pleased to be collaborating with CLAS. Since Diana took over the leadership, we've had a great collaboration, and we'll continue to do so moving forward. I don't want to take more time. I know you're here to hear about Chile, and Diana will go ahead and introduce our panelists. You're not introducing the panel? I am introducing them. Okay, so I will. I will. I don't have all of your bios on the top of my head. I'll go ahead with your titles. Diana is a professor of government here at Georgetown, and she's the director of the Center for Latin American Studies. She just started leading the center this past summer, and we are incredibly pleased to have her leading the center. To her right, we have Arturo Valenzuela, who's professor emeritus of government at Georgetown. He has a long bio. He worked at the State Department, National Security Council, both President Clinton and President Obama. I sort of know your bio by heart. And he's also an expert on constitutional law and the Constitution in Chile, and has been incredibly present in Chile, talking about the current reforms taking place in the country. Guillermo Larrain, a dear friend, he is right now a teacher at the Universidad de Chile. He participated as a candidate for the previous Asamblea Constituyente, but unfortunately did not make it. But he's an economist. He has a PhD from La Sorbonne, I think, in Paris, and in economics, and has been Superintendente de Pensiones, I think, and former president of the Banco de Estado. And then Karin Rosemblatt, she's a teacher at the University of Maryland. She's an expert on gender issues in Chile, if I recall correctly. And I'm going to apologize because I don't know by heart your formal title, but I think I did my best to remember everyone's credentials. So thank you for being here today, and welcome.
Thank you. And we will just begin right away with the three presentations. Dr. Valenzuela will go first, speaking about politics and the Constitution, and then Professor Larrain on political economy in Chile over the last 50 years and going forward, and then Professor Rosemblatt talking about a few cultural, historical, and societal questions and challenges. So we'll begin with Dr. Valenzuela.
We'll do number 2 because number 2 works better than number 1. Besides, number 1 is yours, not mine is 2. No, it's a pleasure to be here, to see so many familiar faces. And it's a challenge for any of us who are professors who do seminars to speak in 15 minutes. So if I take 45 minutes, that's par for the course, you know, right? So you'll bear with me. Uh, uh, that's right. And with the reason why I'm going to insist on a little bit more time is that I'm not going to do 50 years since the coup. I'm going to do 55 years in Chile, you know, since the election of Allende, which is before that. And that's in 68 and 69 was when I was in Chile doing my dissertation research, which was supposed to be done in France, on local politics in France, but it wasn't my professors at Columbia University who said, you shouldn't be doing something in France in local politics. Mais je suis produit de la mission civilistique française. You know, I went to French schools as a kid. So, you know, this was the thing that I wanted to do. And it was my colleagues like Alex Wilde and others in the doctoral program at Columbia who suggested go down and do a study of local government. And so I went to Chile in 1968 and 69, you know, which was at a time when the Frey government was still in power. And I chose 14 municipalities, you know, to go visit. And it was quite an experience at the particular time. I was affiliated with INSORA, which was the Institute for Administration at the University of Chile at that particular point. And so I would go out in these 14 municipalities and I would talk to people. And invariably, I had a Volkswagen Variant in a sleeping bag. So that was my modus operandi, you know, no time to go to hotels or to go back to Los Angeles or something like that. So, you know, I would pull over on the side of the road with my sleeping bag, you know, and I would go to sleep there. But 3 times a policeman intervened, you know, twice on horseback. You know, what are you doing here? Lying here, you know, this is illegal. But very kindly, they invited me to the comisaria, you know, to the police station, you know, and gave me a nice bed. So that was fine. And then during the day, what I would do is I would first interview the Secretario Municipal. See, this is why it's going 5 minutes already. I would interview the Secretario Municipal, but then I would interview some of the other regidores, you know, of each of the 14 municipalities, and the mayor. And I was also invited to dinner by the mayor. And guess who the mayor would invite? Other members of the city council, including members that were of a completely opposite party. So, you know, in a couple of the municipalities, you had a communist mayor, you know, who would serve only for 2 years, but by agreement with the rightist party, where the next one would serve for 2 years so there was complete cooperation among all of these people at the local level to see what they would be able to do. And here I'm going to cut it short, you know, but I actually went to the center then. I went to Santiago, and I began to figure out how it was that the local municipalities related to the national ones. And this is when it became clear to me that the political parties were the key to the Chilean political system. They were the link between the center and the locality, and the parties were very, very strong. I had the 69 congressional election taking place going on at that time, and I would go watch some campaign things, and I'd ask people who were coming to campaign rallies and so on, what do you think is going on? And I remember very well asking one person, look, who are you going to vote for? I'm not going to vote for this guy. Well, why did you come to this rally? Because they give us good food, you know, in carreras a la chilena and other things like that, which really are kind of fun, you know. And well, which candidate can you vote for? Well, I can't vote because I'm illiterate. You know, I don't read. So no. And so but who do you like? These people knew exactly who they would have voted for. So there was a very strong party identification. I guess that's the first point that I was going to make on this. This begins to erode not too long after that. And that's where you get, you know, this is why some years later, some colleagues in Chile came out with this book here, this is a book on local politics in Chile. And this is a book that came out later by Luna and Mardones called La columna vertebral fracturada. y los revisando intermediarios políticos en Chile, based on my book. And what were they saying? What's lacking are political parties. And that's one of the real serious problems that we have today. So that's bringing me now to the current situation. I'll come forward, what we have is a situation where, in fact, the intermediarios políticos, the political party system has crumbled. And without a strong political party system, it's very difficult to have a representative democracy. Remember, that's what we're after, a representative democracy. Representative democracy means that the key to the representative democracy has to be, the ability of the people to express themselves through organizations that tend to then, in fact, develop laws. Okay, maybe what I should do is start thinking about ending. Where is Chile today in one of the most difficult crises that they've ever had? Ironically, because the other thing, I spent with Katie, my wife, who's right here, a whole month of August in Chile, talking about the 50 years of the coup, traveling through the country. It's an amazing country compared with the country I left in 1960 after the earthquake destroyed my school in Concepcion, a French school, of course. That's why I wanted to do French politics. We flew to Temuco, and the planes fly fantastic. The roads are fabulous. The extreme poverty that I remember as a child growing up in Concepcion, Chile, disappeared in Chile. O sea, la extrema pobreza ya no existe in Chile. But what we have in Chile clearly is a middle class that is extremely vulnerable, and it's still a very classist society, with extreme divisions and denigrations of others. So there are all of these kinds of things that need to be overcome. And I'll end by just simply saying the whole process of constitutional reform, which has been essentially the call that hasn't been answered yet by the protests of the 2019, is coming to an end, and it's going to be a failure. And it's going to be a failure because it cannot go forward. If the people approve the current version of the Constitution that was designed by the convention, that would be an absolute disaster. Have you ever heard of a Constitution that's 184 pages long? What's the real problem with this Constitution that they're going to be asking the president to submit to a plebiscite? 184 pages long. Do you know how long the Constitution of the United States is? Huh? The entire Constitution of the United States, with all of its 26 amendments since 1789, is here. It's 15 pages, okay? A Constitution is not supposed to prescribe all kinds of different sort of modalities to work. A Constitution doesn't prescribe how things are supposed to finance. A Constitution doesn't say how many administrative agencies have to be put together and so on and so forth. What it does is that actually, if this is approved, it really would destroy the possibility of having a genuine representative democracy. And now I really will end. There are two real problems that Chile still have to overcome. And how is the Constitution going to be changed from now on? In the way it used to be changed. The Constitution that exists today is not the Constitution of Pinochet. It's a Constitution of Pinochet that was revised many times, and it was revised according to the constitutional precepts that go way, way back in Chilean constitutional history, and that is the Congress, the legislature does make the amendments to the Constitution, and that's what we're going to have to see for going forward. But there are two things that need to be fixed. One is hiperpresidencialismo, and this is where you have a real conflict between, in a presidential system, between two bodies that are elected with popular legitimacy, which is the Congress and the president, which you don't have in a parliamentary form of government, which is one of the reasons why I'm been more favorable to parliamentary forms of government. But the second thing was a big mistake that was made in Latin America, in thinking, well, since presidents often don't, are not majority presidents, well, then we'll have a second round. Well, the second round actually made things much worse, much worse, because it meant that sectors that would normally come together, are competing with one another. And since Cynthia McClintock is right here, and thanks very much for being here, I'll use Peru. You know, what happened in Peru when you had Ollanta Humala way over on the left and Keiko Fujimori way over on the right, and the middle, who was in the middle? Castañeda was in the middle, you know, the mayor of, Toledo was in the middle, and PPK was in the middle. And why did those three not get together? They didn't get together because they all thought they would get into the second round. And this has contributed to destroying the political parties in Chile too. So there has to be some changes. My formula is very a simple one. You know, there has to be a second round in the Congress, but in the Congress, the first majority needs to be able to get a full program on the table, and the Congress needs to be able to vote on it. So you have to create in a representative democracy institutions that encourage and that work towards trying to create what you might call consensus government. The efforts of una política transversal in Chile, as they call it, have completely failed in this last effort. So Chile has a real long road, difficult road ahead. Thank you very much.
I'm an economist, so I feel naked if I don't have any slide over there. So I will show you some graphs in my discussion. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here, pleased to be here with friends and masters in some cases as well. I would like basically to see 3 points. One is the economic reforms that were undertaken in the 80s, but from a developmental point of view, so some form of historical perspective. Second, I want to highlight that the human rights violations that characterized the Pinochet regime were not the price that had to be paid for these reforms. And then how to move ahead and some of the concerns we have today, which I share a lot what Arturo was just saying. So let me, this is GDP per capita in Chile as a share of the US and Australia's GDP. Why Australia's? Because it's a natural resource endowed country, very rich, very far away from large population centers. So it's a kind of benchmark for us, which is very, very important. So 55% there on the left is the share of Chile's GDP to Australia's GDP in 1923, using Madison data. And then US, we were 40% of US GDP in 1923. Since then, there is let me see whether I have, okay, no. So there is a period of some stability on average terms with a lot of volatility up to the Second World War. After the Second World War, what happened is a steady decline in the relative situation of Chile as compared with the US and with Australia. And I will show you later on graphs with the rest of the world. It's basically the same story everywhere. So it's a story of decline that started in the 50s and went all through 1973. Then came the dictatorship. So what the dictatorship did is that they stopped the decline. And this is an important thing to bear in mind when we judge the current, the economic reforms taking in that period. When you look at the average, for example, rate of growth of the economy, it was very poor. When you look at the average inflation rate, was very high. When you look at the average unemployment rate, was very high as well. So in principle, one could say that the economic reforms undertaken in the 80s were a failure. Whereas when you take this, they achieve something, is that they stop a decline that started 40 years earlier. Now, what happened later on is that there is a recovery process, and that recovery process is when democracy was recovered. So this is from an Acemoglu-Robinson perspective, if you say, could say it's a kind of interesting case because it shows that purely capitalist institutions are not enough to promote sustainable and inclusive growth over the years. You need to have a sound democratic system that accompanies those institutions, capitalist institutions, and I believe the Chilean case show that very well. But it's important from this perspective to show or to highlight that those reforms did something, that they achieved something, and that is the decline. Now, here I have the graphs with many other countries, and the story is basically the same. The decline that you see in all those cases with Latin America, with Europe, with kind of Latin Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world is basically the same. The story repeats in every case. Decline, the tension of that decline, and then recovery later on is very, very important. So what were those reforms? We passed from a closed economy to an open economy. There were strong state intervention, a lot of prices that were fixed, a lot of intervention in the exchange in the exchange rate, a lot of industries, state-led industrialization. All that was part of that model that led to the decline. Macroeconomic instability, extreme instability in growth, in inflation rate, in unemployment a bit less, but anyway, very low savings rate. So those reforms brought something valuable that stopped the decline, but democracy brought really something essential that allowed the recovery. That's my first point that I would like to make. This was a kind of achievement that need to be treated. Now, second point, sorry, you don't see that very well, but anyway, I will leave the slide with you. Those reforms were the price of the human rights violations? My feeling is not. Why? Is because here I have the first years of the dictatorship, and I basically make a kind of taxonomy of what happened between just after the coup d'etat until 75, then 75 and 76, and then 77 onwards. The real sort of neoliberal reforms were undertaken heavily since 1977 and later. The first 3 or 4 years of the dictatorship were reforms that had other inspirations. The first 2 years were basically devoted to stabilize the economy. Inflation was very high. We were in the middle of the first oil shock, and therefore there was a big recession going on. So a lot of the reforms that were undertaken in that period were devoted to stabilize the economy. I'm not saying that any country would have done exactly the same, but all of them would have more or less think about restraining fiscal policy and having some form of inflation, anti-inflation policy. In 75, 76, there is an important change because in the first years, and Arturo knows that very well, there was a kind of fight within the junta militar in which there was some neoliberal people really imposing reforms together with some nationalistic developmental people which were very close to the Air Force and to the police. We're talking about a military junta. That's why I'm talking about these two groups. But these people were against Pinochet, and Pinochet himself did some form of second coup d'etat within the junta in which he tried to impose his own view of things, and therefore that what started happening in 74, 75 onwards, and the full triumph of this approach came with in 1977 when he appointed finally the full group of kind of Chicago-based people that undertook all the reforms that are in gray there, which are all those that you find that are, so to speak, neoliberal. Now, concerning the future, we have two things here. I agree that the reform, the project is very complicated. We need to, there is a very slight improvement in governance in the current proposal, because we have a 5% limit for parties for representation, and that will reduce some form of fragmentation. But it doesn't change the nature of the presidential system, which I agree it's really in a very poor situation. But on the same hand, it's a very rigid and heavily programmatic constitution. It will, without changes, it will certainly lead us to repeat the problems that we have suffered, in particular in the last 20 years, I think. So my guess is that It's a very complicated period. Arturo explained that very well just before me. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. So what I want to do this morning is to sort of paint an urban tableau for all of you. Well, actually two urban tableaus, one maybe from 1985 and one from today. I've just come back from a month in Chile on Monday. So I'm going to share some of my impressions from that. And then if time permitting, we'll get to some more hard data maybe. So what would Santiago, and my vision is largely limited to Santiago, what would Santiago have looked like in 1985? If you were walking down the street, maybe in downtown Santiago, well, it was likely you could have come across a protest against the Pinochet regime. So it was a moment of a lot of street mobilizations. You might have come across some tear gas, but certainly you would have come across a lot of smog. Santiago, as a result of lack of regulation, was a heavily, heavily polluted city. Many days when I was living there, I lived about a kilometer from the Cerro San Cristobal, you couldn't see it. It was completely covered in smog. And a good deal of the smog was created by industry, but also by buses that were completely unregulated. They were racing through the streets, really packs and packs of them with people hanging out the doors, completely unregulated public transportation system. The great thing about it is you could basically go anywhere you wanted, door to door. You could stop a bus wherever you wanted on the street and just kind of get on. If you were luckier, you might get to go on the metro, which had at that point 2 lines that had been created during the Popular Unity government. In the universities, which is, sort of my home, you would have had very little access. I mean, the universities were incredibly poor, obviously no heating in any classrooms, and little access to any kind of materials, especially materials that were produced outside of Chile. The universities were very still heavily affected by the purge that had taken place following the coup. So there was very little alternative thinking within the universities. Much of that was confined to non-governmental organizations, which is where most of the left and center-left academics were lodged. There was very little nightlife in Santiago because there was, for much of the 1980s, a curfew. So any social gatherings would be de toque a toque. In other words, they would start at the curfew at midnight or 1 and go until 6 in the morning. As a result of that, there were very few restaurants, not that people could really afford them, very few bars, discotheques. Recreational drugs were confined to cocaine, which came through Peru if you had money, or the local Chilombiana weed if you were a university student. In the poorer neighborhoods, young people sniffed glue. The life for gay life, LGBT people, was confined to maybe 2 or 3 bars in Santiago, and they were regularly raided and shut down by the police. On the streets, you would see, as you still do today, a lot of street vendors. They would be selling, medicinal herbs, handicrafts, and maybe small little tubes of peanuts and sweets. At the time, there were maybe 2, maybe 3 malls, if you could really even call them that, in Santiago. So that was, maybe 1985. So what does Santiago look like today? And I have to say, I'll agree with Arturo. Having lived in the United States, if I think about the last 20 or 30 years, yes, there have been changes, but basically I feel like I live in the same society. When I go to Chile, even if I've only been away a year and a half, I feel like I'm in a completely different place. So the pace of change has been really astounding. So what is Chile like today? Well, Santiago is still a very polluted city, but there are many days in which you can not only see the Cerro San Cristobal, but you can see the Andes from the mountain. Part of this is due to the regulation of the bus system. So now we have newer buses and the bus routes are regulated, but also there are 6 new metro lines in Santiago. So very easy to get around on public transportation. And also very recently, I would say in the past few years, lots of bike lanes. On most days, at least, I would say people are not worried about coming across a street protest. They're very worried, though, about security and being robbed on the street. What does the university setting look like in Chile today? There's, still a lot of books that missing in libraries, but most academics have had training abroad and contacts abroad. So Chile is the university system is much more involved in kind of global conversations and much more open to the world. Nightlife is really booming, I would say, and there are restaurants and bars everywhere. I mean, this is one of the things that really shocks me about Santiago, because when you think about what people earn, it's hard to think about where they get the money for the $4 coffees in Santiago.
And they have to have a cell phone, because this is one of the things that destroyed us. You can't go in any restaurant in Chile and look at a menu. You have to do the.
So today in Santiago, you can buy pot candies from street vendors. And if you go to any of the large dance parties, there's lots of different designer drugs. In terms of commerce, there's, going down the street, what you see are a ton of pharmacies, usually at each intersection, 4, one on each corner, lots of places selling used clothes, and lots of fast food. If you go into a restaurant, you're likely to encounter a server who is Venezuelan or Peruvian. In my first day in Santiago on this last trip, as I walked down Providencia, one of the main streets, I came across 3 lesbian couples kissing or holding hands. I would never have seen this in Chile, I think even 3 days ago. You might, walking down the street, also come across someone, a Haitian, a Cuban, or a Venezuelan who is of Afro-Latin American descent. In the 1980s, most Chileans had not seen anyone who was visibly Black, except maybe on television. Street vendors in Santiago are still selling handicrafts, but they also sell a lot of cheap clothing from China. And outside the Católica metro station, where we used to have the Ministry of Defense and it was really fenced off, there's now a street vendor who is hawking vegan sushi. So that's sort of my street level view of Santiago. How am I doing on time? I'm good. Okay. So, to give you some more kind of hard data, what does Chile look like today? One of my areas of specialty is gender, so we can talk a little bit about that. There have been really dramatic changes in gender relations. In 1980, the birth rate was 2.7 children per woman. Today, it's 1.4. Chile has an exceedingly low rate of marriage. And it has really declined rapidly from 8.8 per 1,000 inhabitants to today 4.4. So, half as many people married, and it's dipped even lower than that. And really, I mean, no one in my family is married. I mean, most of the young people I know in Chile completely forego marriage. Women's employment has gone up quite substantially. Let me see. Well, I won't bother you with the specific data on that. But in the 1980s, maybe 30% of working age women were in the workforce, and today it's nearer to 50%. Yes, correct. Although when you look at the data, you will see that there is a higher workforce participation among immigrants, definitely much higher, but also among the younger age group. So if you go to women my age, actually the workforce participation is quite a bit lower. And you could ask if that's about discrimination or about preferences. It would be interesting. I have not seen anyone doing any research on that. There is still definitely a a wage gap. About 10% women earn about 50 cents for each dollar that men earn. That was 39% in 2006. So there has been some improvement. Consumption patterns are very different. 88% of all households have internet access at home. In 2012, there were 3.9 million cars. Today, there's closer to 6 million cars. So definitely some access to consumption, but a lot of money and consumption goes towards education. So about 40% of all Chileans finish high school and 31% go to finish university. Well, excuse me, that's the total of the whole population. So 40% of the entire population has finished high school and 31 has finished tertiary education. And if we look at college education, for those my age, it's about 20% have a college education. For those 25 to 35, 40% have a college education. So we're seeing really a boom in college education. And then just say a brief word about migration, which is a huge topic in Chilean society today. About 7.5% of the Chilean population today are immigrants in Chile. There's been a huge growth in immigration in Chile. If we went back to 1982, less than 1% of the population was foreign born. Of these, many, 30% are Venezuelan, 17% Peruvian, 13% Haitian, and 12% Colombian. And it's notable that immigrants in Chile, if they're resident 5 years, have the right to vote in all elections. There's a lot of xenophobia in Chilean society today and a lot of objection to the rise in immigration. As a point of comparison, in the United States, we have 13% of the population is an immigrant population. So, you know, just gives you a little bit of a point of comparison. And maybe I'll just stop there. Well, let me just say one thing. You know, all of this, what this rounds out to is that Chile today is an incredibly diverse society. It's a rapidly changing society. It's a more fragmented society, and it's in civil society. And from my perspective, one of the problems, political problems that Chile faces is that the political system has not been able to capture and represent this diversity in Chilean society. It's very much still stuck, I think, in some of the struggles and fights that go back 15 years. And part of what I think it needs to do is to more accurately reflect some of the changes in Chilean society today.
Working? No. How about now? Okay. Just takes a little while to warm up, I guess. I have a few questions for our panelists, but first I just wanted to see if any of you would like to respond or comment to something you heard another panelist say. There was a lot of head nodding going on while you were listening to each other, and I wanted to know if what each of you had said had raised any additional thoughts.
If I might just add, the issue of crime, of course, really is a very serious issue. When I mentioned that I would be approached by a carabinero or on horseback I never feared while I was driving around Chile in 1968, 69, that somebody was going to come with a gun and take away my car or something like that. It just was not part of it was a highly lawful society then. And the incident of crime is a really serious, and we're not just talking about petty crime, you know, we're talking about organized crime. And organized crime in Chile, ironically, and this is not mentioned too much, comes more from Brazil than any other place. And I have that on good authority.
a small story. In 1988, I wrote a book of poetry. It was fully romantic book. I mean, nothing political, just love and romanticism. And I was forced to leave the draft to the military junta for the censorship. It was impressive. I mean, it was nothing political inside. It came down just with an approval sign and without any. So from that society to the one we have now, I mean, the changes are really amazing. It's an extremely liberal society today, extremely liberal. So it's amazingly, what you said, it reflects well what's going on. And eventually you got a little bit short on that. That's one thing. And the other thing concerning what Arturo had just mentioned, organized crime found Chile without any decent preparation for that. We have never seen that in the past. And eventually, we are not that as bad as Ecuador, probably, but it's a real challenge. The state capacity to fight organized crime is main.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'll ask one question to each of our panelists, but all three, it's directed to one person, but all three of you should feel free to chime in, and then we'll open to question and answer. So my first question, Professor Valenzuela, is for you, but again, everyone should offer their thoughts. You suggested the second round of the constitutional reform will also fail, that it will not pass the vote of the people. And I know at one point Boric had said, if the second one fails, I'm not doing a third one during my term. So my question is, then what?
Well, it's not only Boric saying that they're not going to do another one, but many others have come out as well. For your recommendation, frankly, the best thing I've seen recent on why this constitution should be voted down is what the Comisión de Constitucionalistas de la Democracia Cristiana wrote and just came out with. It's an extremely poignant document which just tears into this 184-page constitution, essentially arguing that if this thing went through, it would make the country ungovernable. It would screw up the court systems. It would bring in the constitutional courts into play. And it's just, it won't protect rights and so on. So I would recommend this to people. I could share this with Diana. It's really very poignant. It was signed by Juan Ignacio Galarcón, Jorge Correa, Javier Causo, Gonzalo Garcia, Augusto Quintana, Jose Ignacio Núñez, Edgardo Riveros, and actually somebody who could have been here today, Elisa Walker, Esteban Samuleski, and Andres Saldívar, you know. But it's just extremely poignant in saying that if this constitution goes through, it's a governability problem that you face in the country. With representative democracy, it's actually going down the tubes. We need to worry about two things with representative democracy. One is, direct democracy. That's the best thing for the plebiscites and things like that, or the instruments of the tyrants. And people looking for a messiah, which is the problem that we have in Mexico. Lindo y querido, con un mesías que se cree mesías. That's even worse.
A short comment. I believe the Chilean, I also believe it will probably be rejected this case. We should never get to the point in which the constitutional problem must be solved with a constituent assembly. Because you will end up with, now it's 184 pages. I mean, if you do it on the third time, it would be 250. Because it's a cumulative process. I mean, and you add and add new ideas, and people is always having new things going on. So the big point is, how can we make a constitutional process that is able to heal itself from within? So the flexibility of the Constitution is critical. And by the Constitution, we need not just to think about the book called the Constitution, but all the legal framework which uses supermajority. In the case of Chile today, we have, with the current constitution, we have the constitution, which is quite large, but also the 26 organic laws that are supermajoritarian. And so it is a very large, extremely large legal body. It's totally rigid. And the project that, and I believe this is not mentioned in the document because this was made very quickly, they insist in having a lot of laws would have supermajority voting requirements. So rigidity is a real problem for democracies in the long term.
So if I just may ask you one question. So if the answer is not to have a constitutional committee that writes the constitution, then how will it be written? How would you suggest that is a better form to write?
No, now today, I think the only solution, and the Democracia Cristiana has already mentioned this, there must be a political agreement now in the month that ahead to commit to some reforms to the political system. Not as eventually Arturo and myself would like, some form of parliamentarism, but some form of attenuated presidentialism in the form that the expert committee proposed, which is not ideal, but it's better than what we have now.
Not with a constitutional convention, but actually through with the legislature.
So I'm the culture person here. I'm not going to wade into these political details. But one thing I will say is that there was a lot of criticism of the first Constituent Assembly. But one of the positive things that I came out of it is it installed a lot of topics within the political conversation. And some of those will not go away. I mean, the representation of gender parity, for example, I think is a topic that is definitively installed. There was also, there was a lot of pushback on the topics of indigenous rights and plurinationality, but that was a discussion that had not taken place in Chile, and now it's open. I think it also opened a lot of discussions around questions of environment and control of natural resources. So, there is a bit of a quagmire here, but I think one positive aspect is that there's been vigorous discussion around these issues.
Thank you. The second question I have is for Professor Larrain, but again, please, everyone feel free to answer. And it's a question that Denise and I spoke with you about earlier this week, that it has been said that the Chilean economic model se agotó, that it is, now I forget how we translated that it has come to an end, it is exhausted. Would you agree with that? And if it is the case, then what?
In some sense, yes. In some other sense, no. Not in the sense that we don't need to recreate state monopolies to create industrial power. In that sense, no. I believe that the private sector can still do a lot in terms of economic growth and in terms of development and innovation. Now, where it is exhausted, in the sense that you cannot build an inclusive society just based on market forces. And we put all our faith, and I say we put because I to some extent I was part of that as well, in that kind of approach. When you went to Chile in the 90s or in early 2000s, the faith that markets will solve any kind of problem was really widespread. When you look at, for example, the social, I look a lot of the social movements against this thing. They were all going down in the 90s and the early 2000s. That changed in the middle of the 2000s, and then strikes, sabotage, that kind of thing, huge manifestations went up since the mid 2000s up to today. But in the 90s, people thought that was the way to go. So we need to regain institutional space for solidarity. Now, when you say institutional space for solidarity, that's problematic because many people think that you need to just start redistributing things. So it's not that. We need to learn how to produce solidarity in a way such that it doesn't destroy the inner capacity of the economic system to create growth. And that's the big challenge today. So in one sense, it's exhausted, in another one, no.
And there are clear models in the world of that, including many of the Scandinavian countries historically.
Yeah, sorry, but let me say that the problem is that these Scandinavian countries were very homogeneous, even socially or ethnically. We are now 7% of immigrant population, and I really don't see a lot of enthusiasm for Chileans to be to have solidarity with the Chilean Aboriginal people, even less with immigrants, which are 7.5%. So I'm not sure that we need to create a different form of social democracy, and that's not easy, but that's the challenge.
And I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it to question and answer. And my last question is about the immigrant population. So it's a growing part of the population of Santiago, at least, as you have said. How does integration work? Is there good integration, or is it really very much segmented, or how does that?
Varies for different populations. So I think some of the Venezuelan and Cuban populations that come to the country are actually middle to upper middle class. And I think they have, you know, a road towards integration, and they have the skills to take advantage of what the Chilean society offers them. I think for some other immigrants, like Haitian immigrants, that is much more difficult. But at least legally, Chile has provided a path for immigrant integration. The number of immigrants entering Chile in 2021 and 2022, refugees, is mushroomed. Literally gone up almost tenfold. And I think that is going to be a challenge. Many people who seek asylum in Chile are denied asylum. The immigration system itself is pretty broken. It cannot handle or process the number of immigrants who are coming into Chile. So I think there are lots of challenges. But on the other hand, I do, you know, there is xenophobia in Chile, but I think, like many other countries, that's attenuated by contact with immigrants. And so this is not the first time that Latin American countries have seen huge influxes of immigrants, and they've been able to absorb them, their diverse societies, to begin with. So at least I hold hope.
Okay, wonderful. So now we'll open it up to question and answer from the audience. Do we need to carry around a? Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. So much to say. So how you describe Chile in the 80s, and I grew up in Chile in the 80s. My mom is from Chile. My dad's Black American from here. I was just trying to you took it back to 85, La Micro, all the things that I grew up with going to school. And Chile is unrecognizable today compared to those days. A lot of good things, a lot of bad things. But one thing that I would just wonder, like the assimilation, the same process that existed then, I think is one that exists today. Chileans still, their closest bonds are the people that went to school with them. They continue those bonds. The three main questions that Chileans ask each other and still is the same as, what's your last name? Where do you live? And where'd you go to school? Even though I think things are progressing, I think those things still tie them down. And I think that and this is segue to sort of the question to Arturo and, well, I guess to the whole panel, is getting over these ways of just being as a country. I mean, we're stuck in 50 years ago. And I'm not saying that that everything has been done in order to get over the hurdle. But I'm really concerned. I'm really worried after the estallido in 19 to go through all of the different iterations of the Constitution, all of the protests, all of the destruction that came with it, all of the revealing conversations that came with it as well. And then to get to this Constitution and not have anything. How do you define that? I mean, you talked about the different steps of moving forward. And there's that portion and some of the reforms and parliamentary system or what would be more representative, but culturally, how do you move forward from that? And you're just swinging from left to right, from left to right. It's not centering itself, and I'm just concerned that you might have a reaction that again goes to an extreme, and we repeat some of the things that we've seen in the past again. And as you've correctly stated, culturally, Chile's very different today than what it was back then. So how do you see that going forward? And what do you think are I know it's hard, but what do you think are the main points or issues that need to be watched as we move from December on? That's a hard one.
Well, I'll jump into it if you wish. It is a hard one because it still is a real serious problem. You've nailed it. In that sense, I happen to be the president of the board of trustees of one of the most prestigious high schools in Chile, Santiago College, that just has a huge new school up in La Dehesa, in Los Trapenses and so on. It used to be in Providencia and Lota and so on and so forth. This board, which is a board based in the United States, goes back to the founding of the schools in the 1880s, when there wasn't any education for women, including, the creation of the first schools really for women. But these were with American missionaries. They were coming to Chile. But the struggles that we have today to get a school that is very, very upper class to understand that what they need to do is to work to try to see whether, in fact, they can have programs with other schools with people from different backgrounds. And it's hard to do it. It's a very classist society still. And this business of, oye, negro, and this kind of disparaging sort of attitude is something that still exists. Now, I've seen, however, a very good friend of mine who actually happened to have an extremely important job in the Chilean army at one particular point. He's been retired for some time. Actually runs a program in the summers where he brings kids from very different backgrounds to work together, on a whole series of sort of summer kinds of projects. And it builds a community. It builds a community. And it's the only way to get around this sort of thing. There are experiments in different places in the world to try to do that. I go back a lot earlier than you did in Chile. I remember when Bill Russell came to the play basketball in Santiago. Most of you don't even know who Bill Russell was, but a few of you do. This was something all the kids on the street would look because they'd never seen an African American, and this sort of thing. And the same thing with many of the. I grew up in Concepcion. Many of the ships that would arrive in Talcahuano, and occasionally you would have these African American sailors and so on come in, and people would scoff at them because they just there's still something of that in the country that needs to be overcome, unfortunately. But I feel, however, that there are so many people nowadays, the whole business of gender parity and things like that signify that there is a cultural change that's taking place that needs to be encouraged, and we need to work to find ways to do that, mechanisms to do that. How do you create community?
I think is quite different. And this is why I was talking a little bit about education in Chile. I mean, Chile is an incredibly class stratified society, but there's a reason why there's been so much social protest around schooling, right? Because this is, a way of breaking down some of those barriers. And so that is going to be one of the keys. And there are some good things and there are some bad things. There's more access to higher education, which is really wonderful. It's still true that the outcomes in terms of earning potential, this is from some research of my colleague Sergio Ursu at the University of Maryland, are not equal at all. So for those who go to the University of Chile or the Catholic University education is a real motor of social mobility. If you go to some other places and study education, maybe not so much, or if you study journalism or psychology. But there's also been an expansion of preschool education in Chile. It's still not as good as it should be. About 50% of 3-year-olds go to, have access to some form of daycare. But so I think that those are some of the things that potentially, especially if the quality of education can be improved in Chile, could be quite helpful.
On the what lessons can we learn? I believe Churchill is blamed for all kind of good sayings, but I believe he said something like, "You cannot leave a crisis without learning something." It's much elegant, the wording of him. But anyway, so what can we learn from this crisis? And one thing that I believe Chileans must learn is that it is our fault. It is our fault because we went through several elections, and we chose first a constituent assembly that was plenty of independent people with their own straight agendas that was ungovernable, and then we had the election that was rejected. The constitution was rejected in 21. Then we elected massively. We voted against that massively. And then we elected massively with a mandatory voting in both cases, massively to a constitutional council that is controlled almost by majority for hard right wing people. So it's our fault. So we don't need to blame no one but us on what's going on. And therefore the lesson is that we need to be responsible with those choices, even though there are incoherent or whatever. It's our fault. It's no one else's fault, and therefore we need to learn how to deal with that. And we need to take the chance of allowing the parliament to take care of the reforms that are needed for the constitution.
Hi. I speak years ago, the great historian of Latin America, Tulio Alperin, maligned me for looking at the region through Mexican colored glasses. So I'll admit that at the beginning. And I have only had 2 close encounters with Chile in a long career. The first one is that I lived the coup of 73 in Mexico City, where in those days, all the communication passed through and much of it went public, which was intriguing, but I'm not going to go there. Much to this, in the summer of 1917, I was invited to the Catholic University in Santiago to teach a seminar for graduate students who would be drawn from across the city to introduce the new history of capitalism, or setting the history of Latin America in the history of capitalism on a global scale. The first thing that happened in that seminar is I presumed I was going to be adding to perceptions that my students had. The first class, they made it absolutely clear to me that in their studies in Chile, they had never studied anything but Chilean history within the country and only politics. And it was like, that's all we've done. And I sort of had to step back and go, whoa, open larger questions. It actually was a wonderful seminar. But that was a key learning point. I take that and I want to go to Guillermo's first graph and the bottoming out and then the low point. Everything you said about how that reflected Chilean politics clearly matters. But what I see, and in part because I lived this in Mexico City too in 73, that is the year OPEC broke the world economy. And first question, could that possibly have something to do with the, and other global issues, but that's just such a blatant global issue. Something to do with the economy holding low, the struggles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, can we only look within? And then I guess I want to toss in a last point, getting to then the boom, right, from the 90s forward. And the numbers for per capita GDP growth are impressive. But of course, those figures simply set aside all questions of distribution within. And the group has narrated to us that while there is this whole new life in the modern world, technology, transportation, and public life consumption, there is this undercurrent of street crime, organized crime. And I need to ask, is that somehow reflective of the fact that there is an under society which is simply not involved and is creating its, dare I say, its own economies? Some independently local, some globally linked through Brazil to organized crime. And I kind of love your reflection on all of
it. Yeah, indeed, the OPEC changed everything. I mean, in a global sense. Now, Chile had the chance, so to speak, is that because, for example, in Europe, the oil shock should have implied significant technological changes that would allow those countries to adapt to the new technological environment. That didn't take place immediately, and therefore we saw unemployment rates skyrocketing in many countries, in France, in the UK, in Germany at the time as well. So it took them 10 years to make that reform. So the oil shock coincided almost day by day with the opening of the economy in Chile, and with many of those reforms. So to some extent, the reassignment, the reallocation of resources in Chile that was needed for the new economy coincided with the oil shock, and then Chile, to some extent, started earlier the reforms. Latin America, it took them 15 years to start. So yeah, that was a big change. I think to some extent it may explain some of the. You're right. That's a good point. Now, in terms of what's going on now, the big challenge for us, and I believe to some extent for Latin America as well, is how to transform we call the matriz productiva. How we can translate that? The productive matrix. Well, okay, very simple. We must change that from purely extractivist natural resource utilization to transformation, innovation, and knowledge. And that's not easy. That's really not easy because there are too many interests in the extractivist industry. But we need to move that, and universities are trying to play a role. We are trying to implement some form of industrial policy, so to speak, which now we can talk about industrial policy because the US sanctified the name once again, but it was totally impossible to talk about this 10 years ago. So we are now probably we will eventually advance in this direction.
And of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're still facing kind of a world challenge. This is not just an issue for Latin America. And when I was Assistant Secretary of State is when we were talking about the, Asia Pacific, initiative. And I remember many of my colleagues in Latin America were saying, why is it that the United States at this particular point is so interested in a geostrategic component to this? We want to just talk about trade. Basically saying, what about our being able to just sell our raw materials to the Chinese? And when in the last administration here in the United States they withdrew from this Asia Pacific initiative. Yeah, guess what? Many of my same colleagues in Latin America would call me back and say, what a shame. We were missing the country that was helping us to understand that there was a geostrategic component, which essentially means that, in fact, the Chinese not only have to import your raw materials, but also accept those materials that you are also producing with a value added component to it, which goes back to your point right there. And this requires effectively, international standards and international institutions that really function properly.
Chile is, has reduced poverty substantially, and especially reduced extreme poverty. It still exists. I have to agree with Guillermo that the social safety net has to be more robust than it is. There have been positive steps in that direction in terms of pensions, in terms of the healthcare system, but more needs to be done. And Chile has very low tax rates still, even though they've been increased. I mean, among the lowest of the OECD. So there's that, you know, raising both taxes for industry, but also personal income tax faces a lot of opposition from the right. But taxes have been increasing. There have been several increases in the past few years, and probably more will be or should be ahead at least.
Good morning. My name is Angela Christian. I was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I was in 4th grade when the Allende government was overthrown. And I just remember this event being the first international incident that was discussed with us children in school, and also the first one that my parents discussed with me. Also, my father's an alumnus of the University of Chicago. After the coup, I would say for about 2 years, both in the local press in the US Virgin Islands and in the Puerto Rican press, there was vigorous debate about what this would mean hemispherically. So I guess my question is for Dr. Valenzuela. Can you say what this coup, how this coup reverberated in the Americas?
Well, it reverberated in a very strong way, particularly because there was some concern when Allende was elected that he shouldn't have been elected. So this goes back to the Nixon administration, where, you know, if Henry Kissinger's famous phrase at that particular point was, the United States cannot stand idly by and allow a country to go communist because of the irresponsibility of its people, or something like that, is what Henry Kissinger literally said. I think I mock him and mimic him, because that's exactly what he said. And what he was worried about was not, he didn't really care whether, in fact, in Chile you had a Marxist government coming into power. What he was worried about was what would happen in Italy and what would happen in France and other places like that. So it was the notion that, you know, you had a communist government coming to power, not through the force of arms, but through the constitutional process in a democratic situation. And that's the thing that that they were pushing back on. And that had an enormous impact, including the beginning of the United States effort to try to bar Allende from coming to power. That starts right then. So we're talking about the Cold War. We're talking basically about the Cold War and what that meant at that particular point so I would underscore that that's one of the most important things, because it's not only Chile that loses its democracy, but Uruguay, one of the longest standing democracies in the region as well. In fact, there are only 4 countries that actually avoid what Guillermo O'Donnell called the sort of authoritarian state, which means military command in Latin America during this period. There's Venezuela, ironically, and Colombia, ironically, and Costa Rica, not ironically, and Mexico, but only Mexico because, as Vargas Llosa said, tiene la perfecta dictadura already. So I'll just keep it at that. But you had a question way in the back. Yeah, no, on the right side. No, the woman right behind the woman who just asked the question. You had your hand up. Oh. No.
I have.
Oh, I must have mistaken her hand.
I have a question regarding if you see the history of Chile, the 1833 Constitution, 1925 Constitution, the coup d'etat, and this constituent process, you could see that as a disciplined act to the over-politicization. Professor Rosemblatt said that the complexity of Chilean society have not been captured by the political system. And if you see the constituent process, the this complex constituent process with two processes ongoing, or one of them almost finished, how you balance the necessity of stability with the necessity to adapt the political system to the complexity of the society. If you see the 19 protests as a manifestation of the civil society, in my opinion, by the first time in Chilean history, not related with institutions, not military, not political parties, not just the civil society, and in which the establishment just see the process from outside. How to balance that necessity with the necessity of stability. Professor Larrain, for example, said that when you establish a threshold of 5%, you provoke atomization of political system and you affect the stability of the governance. So the necessity of the adaptation, the necessity of adaptation to the complex of society, to capture civil society, to the participation of civil society, is also a necessity. How to balance that? That's my question.
Okay. Well, it's not easy, of course. My feeling is that, first of all, this is a kind of universal challenge. It's not a problem uniquely in Chile. We are seeing that a bit everywhere. And you see many countries kind of trying different recipes for doing that. For example, the Irish have these citizens' assemblies in which they convene people to discuss, ordinary people selected randomly to discuss a particular issue, such as abortion in the case of Ireland, which was very famous. So that's one thing. How to, without replacing representative democracy, because totally agree here with what Professor Valenzuela just said, how can we give society more instruments to express themselves or to correct the political system when the political system takes some kind of biased way? It could be a citizens' assembly, it could be some form of legal initiative, popular initiative of law, that kind of thing. It's not, I'm not aware of a kind of consensus around this, but we need to give more instruments to society to work, but within the political system. So the big thing is that social society, it's a kind of too widespread set of people and groupings with uncoordinated objectives and means. So it can be chaotic. And therefore, we need to force them, to help them, if you want, to get within the representative system. And therefore, there are some instruments lacking. And I believe some of those are promising.
And those instruments, the key instruments, are political parties. And essentially that, let's go back to James Madison. James Madison in Federalist Number 10, railed against factions. But after he was president, he recognized that, in fact, for representative democracy to work, you need to have political parties. So if you are an organization of the civil society, and you really want to have some say in, creating laws and so on and so forth, then what you need to do is to work to try to see how you can have your views represented through a political party, and political parties should look for elements in the civil society that reflect their particular programs and their views. It's creating programs, and this doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily have similar kinds of organizations, because after all, societies have a lot of diversities of views, and you have to have the diversities of views represented in the parliament, essentially, and I agree, you should not have a constitutional convention every other time. It has to be done through the legislature, through the Congress, and whether it's parliamentary form of government or a presidential form of government, that's the key. Political parties that effectively represent the wishes of the citizenry, in their ability to be able to have a say, which is what democracy is all about. It's the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, in Lincoln's famous phrase.
Yeah, so I've forgotten where I was going with this. The question was about sort of stability in I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. Let's go to a new question.
Can we take two? Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. So I am Chilean, and so regarding this reflection about the importance of political parties. So what is happening with the center in Chile? Because it seems that today we have to choose between the left, like from the Socialist Party to the left, or in the right from Renovación Nacional to the right. And one of the critical actors of these 50 years have been, for example, the Christian Democrats, and their role have been diminished over time. So what is happening with the center? Why they are not making sense to the people at this point?
Yeah.
Well, look, there's something that often we tend to forget, and that is if you look at public opinion in most democratic countries, public opinion does not have what you might call a U shape. A U shape where you have extremes on the left and extremes on the right. In most countries, public opinion across the world, but and in much of Latin America, is a bell shape where the extremes on the sides are relatively small compared with the middle. Now, the folks at the top of this bell shape curve, can be people who are not interested in politics. They may be indifferent to politics, or they may be people who have, in fact, much more moderate opinions about things. And but those are the people who need to be sort of recruited by political parties then, And it isn't an issue of whether you have a centrist political party or not a centrist political party. It is whether, in fact, even when you have parties that have different opinions, I was very impressed when I was interviewing those local officials. In some municipalities, I don't know if I said this before. The mayor would be elected by the council, and if there was somebody on the far left and somebody on the far right, what they would do is they would split the mayoralty. For 2 years a communist, and for 2 years, somebody from Renovación Nacional, or their predecessor organizations. So I think that's the way it needs to go. It's not that you need more moderates. What you need to do is have effectively ways in which people who have very different kinds of opinions can nevertheless come to a decision that will benefit everyone by realizing that you have to make some compromises along the way.
Went back to, I think your opening anecdote is an important one. If you went back to the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, the Chilean political parties had tentacles into civil society, so that even, soccer clubs or centros de madres, mother centers, had particular political affiliations. And that is definitively not the case with the political parties today. And then we also have we have an internet society, and we're still kind of figuring out what that means in terms of the political process. But I was just in Chile, and I was talking to one of the advisors for someone who was from the Frente Amplio and the first Constituent Assembly. And one of the criticisms he had of the Frente Amplio and the way they operated within the Constituent Assembly is that they were unable to kind of make an alliance with some of the social movements. And I think that those are some of the connections that could, potentially allow for a greater degree of expression through the political system.
three brief things. One is that when you ask people whether they belong to the center, everyone says yes. So the bell shape is in society. I mean, people believe that they're all center to the left or to the right, but nobody recognizes to be on the extremes. So that's an interesting sociological kind of thing. The other thing is that with mandatory voting, because Chile now moved to a mandatory voting scheme, that people will have to express themselves, because it's true that most of that people may be kind of indifferent and they are lazy or whatever, so they don't express themselves. Now they are mandated to do so. So to some extent, political parties will have to take into account their interests and their views, which was not the case in the previous. Now, concerning the Christian Democrats, because Simon knows that I'm Christian Democrat, so I need to answer that. My feeling is that in a presidential, and of course, Arturo, please correct me if you don't agree with this, but in a
Okay, I will.
in a presidential system, I believe that when the center think about itself as an arbiter between the left and the right, is destroyed. So the center can only exist in a presidential system when it has a project which will induce the center and the right to support that project. But the Christian Democrat, to some extent, they decided, or they were not able to create a proposal that was leading the country. Each with the radicals in the 30s and 40s, and with the Christian Democrats in the 60s, and then with the return of democracy, you had centers that were leading the way. But we decided, or it happened to us, that we not longer leaded the way in the 2000s, and therefore we were basically declined.
Quick question. President Gabriel Boric, I don't think anybody's mentioned his name today.
He's in town.
He's in town. And that's my question. If before, you obviously missed a good discussion, probably will learn.
Boric is sitting in the back.
But what, yeah, I wish. If he were to stop by, what would be your advice to him to survive the next 2 years and not end up much worse than he is currently?
Well, I think he's actually been fairly astute at doing that. You know, it's a learning process, and it takes a while, but he has been reaching out to various different sectors of the society, and I think that he's pushed back a little bit on some of the more extreme positions within his, and he's understood that. And in fact, the fact that he also said that, you know, with the end of this constitutional process, we need to sort of forget about having a repeat of this. If this goes down to failure, that what we need to do is to go back to the way in which, you know, we need to govern ourselves, and you change the Constitution the way we've discussed it right now, through the rules of the game that are expressed in the Constitution now. And the Constitution that we have had ever since, you know, the Pinochet lost the plebiscite of 1980 is a Constitution that actually has been changed over time in rather significant ways, with some mistakes and some, you know, good things to it. I myself very much am in favor of mandatory voting, because mandatory voting does, in fact, you know, put some kind of an onus you know, on the citizenry to say, listen, you know, we're supposed to participate. And the empirical evidence of this across the globe is quite clear. When New Zealand switched to compulsory voting, it really did improve the political process.
Taxation and representation.
Taxation and representation.
So I would also say, like, there's been a lot of emphasis on the constitutional process. And I do think that the whole question around rewriting the Constitution and doing away with Pinochet's Constitution, it's a kind of an important symbolic measure. But many of the things that prompted the protests in 2019 don't run through the constitutional process necessarily. They have to do with pensions, education, healthcare. And there's still a lot of work to be done on those topics. And I would just say, move forward.
And those topics need to be dealt with in the legislature and not in the Constitution that is now being proposed. And that's the real problem with this Constitution. Again, it tries to legislate constitutionally. Constitutions are supposed to come up with very broad principles and all the rights. And in fact, the committee on experts was correct, in all the definitions of what the rights should be. But those sorts of things, those rights, are not a substitute for the actual laws that implement those rights. And the laws that implement those rights then require, in fact, a separation. And this is why this particular constitution that has been proposed needs to go out the door.
Yeah, there are two things. Sorry, there are two things. One, Chile has been polarizing a lot, and you know that very well. You go often there. There's a lot of polarization, but not only that. There is polarization and fragmentation. We have today 23 or 24 parties represented in Congress. It's ungovernable. Now, the big thing for President Boric is that if you compare his reaction to the incapacity to produce certain legislations in areas that for him were very critical, such as pensions, and you compare his reaction to Petro's reaction in Colombia, for example. Petros took the radical approach, okay? Whereas Boric has not done that. He has insisted in dialogue. He has insisted in creating conditions without real success. So I would not suggest nothing to him. I would suggest something to the opposition in Chile. I believe the opposition needs to reinforce that attitude that Boric has displayed in local issues. And the way to do that is that he needs a success. So some form of agreement in, for example, the pension reform, which is totally absurd. We are very close to that, but the polarization is not allowing that. I believe he needs a success in the pension reform because he's trying he's avoiding Petro's decision process, and he needs to have a success in that. So my point would not go to Boric, but to opposition.
Thank you. With that, I think we will close for the day. It is 11:30. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our guests for having.